Hi everybody, it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you, and thank you, Tom, for the invitation. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk about ways in which organisations can better protect workers dealing with sensitive and potentially traumatic records. So just to give you an idea of what I'm hoping to cover, I'll start by defining person-centred approaches and also how trauma-informed practice fits under that broad umbrella. I'm going to move on to frame why record workers need to have an awareness of trauma. So I'll offer some definitions for trauma and also secondary trauma, just so that we have some groundings as we move through the rest of the talk. Just to clarify terminology, I did title this talk Looking After the Archivist, but I'm actually going to use the term record worker throughout the presentation to encompass archivists, but also records managers, volunteers, and anyone else who engaged with records as process and practice in their role as in a working context. So I'm then going to look at the relationship between secondary trauma and records work. So I'm going to draw on a range of important pieces of research that have looked at building empirical evidence that demonstrates that record workers without proper safeguards in place are at risk of suffering from secondary trauma. And I'll then introduce what trauma-informed approaches look like in our field, and then we'll look more specifically at what support structures organisations should have in place for record workers to reduce the risk of work-related harm. Before I really get into things, I just want to make you aware that my talk doesn't contain specific examples of traumatic records or collections. I do make reference to individual experiences of exposure to traumatic records. I think talking about trauma, even in very broad terms, as I will do today, can bring to the surface associations with painful experiences. So I encourage you to do whatever you feel you need to do to prioritise your well-being as I speak. Step away if needed. For example, that might look like taking a pause, getting a glass of water, taking a moment before returning. That's absolutely fine. So let's start by opening up what is meant by person-centred practice in the context of records work. And I'm using framing that was put together in a call for papers for a special issue on person-centred archival theory and practice in the Canadian archive journal Archivaria, which was published in 2022. And the editors of that special issue suggest that person-centred practice fundamentally speaks to a shift in attention from the record, where it's been traditionally focused, to the people that create, keep, use, and are represented in the records. So person-centred practice resonates closely with associated ideas circulated in archive and record-keeping discourse around radical empathy, affect, ethics, care, and active approaches to dismantling oppressive structures and systems. So things like we can think about white supremacy fitting into that, for example. Fundamental to person-centred practice is the idea that we centre the perspectives of the individuals and communities who have been historically harmed by records and archival work. So in practice, we can fit a range of efforts that we see in the sector under the umbrella of person-centred practice. So from efforts at reparative description, redescription projects, to policies that enable greater community control over the consumption of archival content, to trauma-informed approaches. And really importantly, in the context of this talk, person-centred approaches acknowledge the records worker as a person. And so person-centred practice encompasses work on acknowledging secondary trauma and reducing work-related harms for staff, which is what we're focusing on today. Yes, so that's telling us that it's acknowledging the archivist and the records worker as a person in that framework. So let's dig down into why record workers need trauma awareness to be effective in our roles. And here I'm drawing on the international survey that was put together by Kirsten Wright and Nicola Laurent, and that was run through the International Council on Archives. And that sought to build some high-level evidence around a link between archival work and trauma. And it's the widest ranging survey that has been done in the sector on this issue. It received over 1,000 valid responses from 100 countries. And the first key finding that the survey introduces us to is that 87% of the responding archive workforce have recognise that people who come into contact with archives, whether that's staff, volunteers or users, can experience a traumatic reaction from the archive. So internationally, there's not complete, but there's fairly high awareness that archives can carry the potential to traumatise. The second key finding reveals that 68% of the responding archive workers have themselves been exposed to content that they have found distressing or traumatic through their archival work. So if we pause for a second, that's telling us that nearly 70% of the archive workforce have been distressed through their archival work at some point in their career. And that tells us how pervasive this issue is and how seriously we need to take it as a sector. The third significant finding I want to draw out today is what we're shown on the screen, and that's that a whopping 92% of respondents have not been taught about these concepts as part of their archival education. And nearly 70% have not been exposed to these concepts since their archival education through professional development, training or further education. So the international archive sector is really facing a skills gap here, where we know that there's a real risk for archive workers and record workers more generally to be traumatised through the work that we do. But we now need to do more to develop education and training for archivists that can raise awareness of what trauma is and build sector knowledge on organisational and individual strategies that can reduce the risk of harm from traumatic exposure for the workforce. So I'm always really grateful for opportunities like this to speak into that training gap. So if we know that archival work carries the risk for workers of being traumatised, let's do some definition building around what trauma is. So in my own work as a mental health and trauma survivor, I lean into definitions of trauma that are rooted in survivor perspectives, working with the idea that trauma results from exposure to one or more events that are significantly emotionally disturbing, which impacts on the whole of the individual's well-being and ability to function. So that's mentally, physically, socially, emotionally, and spiritually. I particularly appreciate the emphasis within Beth Filson's definition of trauma. So Beth Filson is a trauma survivor and researcher who makes it clear that trauma is always a response to external events. No one traumatises themselves. It is subjective and it will be different for different individuals. So only the person can say what is haunting them. And that trauma has deep and serious impacts on the individual. It is pervasive. It does inhabit every corner of life. But that while the impact is serious and often long-lasting, that healing is possible. And we can experience trauma firsthand when distressing events happen directly to us. But we can also experience trauma as records workers by being exposed to the suffering and pain and distress of others. So secondary trauma is a term used to describe the trauma we can experience from knowing about a traumatizing event experienced by someone else. So we're talking about indirect exposure here to trauma, for example, by encountering a first-hand account or a narrative of a traumatic event that a practitioner such as an archivist bears witness to. The term secondary trauma and vicarious trauma are often used interchangeably, and we can think of secondary or vicarious trauma as the record worker experiencing pain by proxy. So what we're talking about today is professionally generated trauma and fatigue and how we reduce its likelihood of occurring. So it's helpful for us to begin to tease out how compassion fatigue, stress, burnout, and vicarious or secondary trauma are interlinked. So compassion fatigue is linked to the emotional cost of caring for other people. So when we are constantly giving out empathetically to others, we can be overwhelmed by the emotional labour of what we're having to do. And so as a coping response, we can become emotionally numbed and detached from the experiences of others. And this numbness and detachment, which may start in the workplace, can spill into other areas of our personal lives. And we can find ourselves also detaching from loved ones outside of the workplace. Now, compassion fatigue and vicarious or secondary trauma are very interlinked, as feelings of numbness and detachment are also common symptoms of secondary trauma. But secondary trauma is more pervasive in disrupting our health and well-being. While it's different for everyone, when we tip into experiencing secondary trauma, we may find that we keep re-remembering the traumatic experience we've been exposed to with associated distressing thoughts. We may start to have very strong feelings that we want to avoid our workplace. We may start to feel very tense, on guard, or on edge at all times. We may have serious difficulty in concentrating, and we may have an upswing in negative emotions and lose interest in things we enjoy, and also lose the ability to rest. Stress also needs to be part of the conversation when we're unpacking occupational trauma and fatigue. Feeling stressed comes as a result of being under pressure or being threatened. Now, our bodies have a stress response which kicks in when we're in a situation that we don't feel we can manage or control. And our bodies regulate pretty well with small amounts of stress. And the hormones we release can help us to focus and be productive through stress. But when we're stressed for prolonged periods, our bodies stop being able to regulate, and the downsides of our stress response begins to tell. So chronic stress disrupts all of our natural rhythms, including sleep, and it puts us at risk of serious health problems. Burnout is a state of overwhelming emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion that we experience as a result of excessive and prolonged stress. So occupational stress and burnout are linked to things like high and unmanageable workloads, but also it's linked to experiencing a lack of control in the workplace. So not having a say in how you do your job, such as your schedule, assignments, or workload. Workers experiencing burnout frequently report how a lack of clarity about what's expected of you has played into the stress. So it's very much linked to feeling unsupported in your role. What we need to be aware of is that occupational stress and burnout can happen in any working context. However, when workers who do carry the cost of caring for others and who are regularly exposed to the traumatic experience of others also have to deal with broader types of occupational triggers for stress and burnout, such as high workloads and lack of support, then the likelihood of experiencing serious adverse effects associated with secondary or vicarious trauma actually increase. So for workers regularly exposed to traumatic content and the trauma of others, workplace culture has a huge impact on whether or not such exposure will tip workers into experiencing the more serious kinds of adverse effects associated with secondary or vicarious trauma. Now, the first empirical piece of research exploring archivists' experiences of secondary trauma was conducted in a Canadian context in 2019. So we've had some awareness as a field that archivists can and do suffer from secondary trauma for 7 years now. And the research involved sending out a survey to Canadian archivists, and one of the surveyed aspects was asking archivists to say whether they have experienced any of the traumatic symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder after working with records of a traumatic nature. And I think the results give us plenty of food for thought as a profession. You can see on the screen that 54% of respondents, for example, report experiencing emotional exhaustion. 47% experienced intense sadness, and 24% experienced intrusive thoughts. What is equally telling is some of the open responses given by survey participants to explain some of their answers to the questions being asked. There was a tendency for survey respondents to underplay their experience of secondary trauma, and we can see from the first respondent who says, "Compared to what others have experienced, I feel like I should be able to tough it out because my experience is so little." There is a tendency for record workers to experience guilt and shame over being affected, coupled with a desire not to appear self-indulgent that prevents record workers from fully acknowledging the impact that the work we do can have on us. And this comes through in the second respondent quotation that says, "While I have experienced anger, sadness, and detachment, numbness, I don't think I would characterise it as secondary trauma. I don't particularly enjoy working with records of trauma, but it did not have a huge impact on my life. I also find it difficult not to find my emotions in these instances somewhat self-indulgent. After all, I'm a cis white male with a good job and very few problems. This shouldn't be about me." So I think there are several things playing into this. Firstly, there's still a pervading idea in our sector around what professionalism entails, that we must be neutral, objective and impartial, and therefore we shouldn't feel or have an emotional reaction to our work, and that if we do, we are somehow unprofessional. It is telling to me that sometimes in feedback from the talks I give on this subject, some audience members echo in their feedback the idea that in giving a talk about secondary trauma and the record worker, I'm somehow not being victim-centred enough. So I want to be clear, my approach to trauma-informed practice, which is embedded in my teaching at UCL, is much broader than just what we're covering today. It is holistic and it is centred on survivors. And I believe wholeheartedly that taking a survivor-centred approach has to encompass ensuring that the record worker, alongside everyone else impacted by records work, is taken care of and protected, because secondary trauma is a very real potential harm for us as record workers. Right, so having highlighted that secondary trauma is a pernicious and ever-present risk for record workers, let's begin to unpack what factors make it more or less likely that a records worker, when exposed to trauma through their work, will have a traumatic reaction. So firstly, let's think about when record workers are tasked to work directly and closely with records depicting the suffering of others. Well, we can begin to pull together an understanding that there are particularities around the nature of the record, the context of the encounter, the time involved, and the individual characteristics of the record worker, which all come into play. So what existing research and discourse in our field indicates, for example, is that the format of the record is an important factor because visual, moving image and audio materials are particularly visceral and therefore carry a heightened potential to traumatise. There are, of course, factors connected to the individual worker encountering the record, so the individual's own experience of trauma and strength of connection to the record will come into play, but equally time is important. So the frequency and length of exposure to a traumatic record impacts on the likelihood of a traumatic reaction. And there are also contextual factors that come into play too, around the level of institutional support provided to the record worker, the extent to which they are aware of what is in the collection and have been offered choice over whether to work with those materials. So hopefully you can see that we can begin to model trauma-informed organisational practices for staff that mitigate some of these risk factors. So, for example, by limiting the amount of time a record worker spends with traumatic content, particularly for audiovisual and more visceral materials, by building in choice for staff over what collections to work with and process, by building in other forms of institutional support. So what we also need to be aware of is that when we're talking about the trauma bound up in the record worker's work, it is not just about the record. It is also about our direct interactions with those that we are supporting, who are also coming into contact with the record. So we are facilitators and mediators for others, and that adds another layer as we witness their reactions to what they are encountering in our holdings. And that comes through in another quotation from a respondent to the Canadian survey who says, "I knew the materials would be difficult to work with, but both I and my organisation vastly underestimated how difficult it would be to work with the records, affected communities, individual survivors and other organisations. There's so much more than the trauma of what is contained in the records. There are the politics around providing access to the records that continues to cause trauma for those of us involved in this kind of work." So archivists therefore face potential exposure to trauma through the direct liaison that we have with individual record subjects and broader users, donors and communities who may in themselves be traumatised in various ways. So witnessing their pain has the potential to traumatise the record worker. But what I want to emphasize really strongly is that when we're working in an institutional culture where we feel unsupported and untrained to meet the needs of those we serve, when we work in an institutional culture that does not recognize the emotional impact of this work, when we're forced to follow protocols and procedures that aren't person-centered, then there is exacerbated potential for us to experience secondary trauma. So in short, we need our institutions to be trauma-informed for the good of our communities, but also for us as workers. So let's now begin to unpack what trauma-informed practice means in the context of our field in particular. So in a nutshell, trauma-informed approaches prioritise the human dimension of our work. They carry an embedded and intrinsic recognition that records and records work carries the potential to traumatise workers, donors, users alike. Trauma-informed approaches inherently centre a consideration of affective and emotional impacts, and they centre the needs of those directly represented in or most affected by the records when designing systems, services and spaces. And trauma-informed approaches seek to embed the principles of safety, trust, choice and collaboration and empowerment across the whole organisation. And I'm going to unpack those principles in a few slides' time. And as part of this, trauma-informed approaches emphasise the vital importance of the well-being of everybody, including the record worker. Now, the ideas and principles underpinning trauma-informed approaches writ large were first developed in mental health contexts by trauma survivors, and this foundational work has since filtered across different fields and sectors, including into our own. And there's an excellent article by Angela Sweeney and Danny Taggart that talk about the emergence of trauma-informed approaches in the mental health context. And a really important point to note is that in that context, trauma-informed approaches are framed as organisational change processes that are focused on preventing re-traumatisation within services. So being trauma-informed is about organisations committing to a whole organisational change process, which is a point that can be easy to lose sight of. And that organisational change process is fundamentally about a commitment to orientate systems and services in ways that do the opposite of trauma. So moving from cultures of fear to safety, from control to empowerment, and from abuse of power to accountability and transparency. Now, the most comprehensive peer-reviewed article to date that's outlined what taking a trauma-informed approach means in the context of archive and record-keeping work has been written by Kirsten Wright and Nicola Laurent. And they outline how they are seeking to apply trauma-informed approaches as first developed in mental health and related fields, but now recognised as a useful framework across a variety of professions and situations to the archival and record-keeping field. And in their initial framing, they align trauma-informed approaches with liberatory memory work, which encapsulates an understanding of how trauma, accountability and healing combine in working towards justice. So under this alignment, trauma-informed approaches are positioned as strength-based, with Laurent and Wright seeking to draw a clear distinction between that kind of approach, which they're outlining in their article, and trauma discourses that are seeped in the language of deficit. So essentially, their framework acknowledges the pervasiveness of trauma and the risk and potential for people to be re-traumatised through engagement with organisations such as archives, and seeks to minimise triggers and negative interactions. So it's providing a framework of safety, and it offers this model of collaboration and empowerment that recognises and centres the expertise of the individuals and communities documented within the records held in the archive. So trauma-informed practice in their framework also provides a way for archivists to practically implement a lot of the ideas that are discussed elsewhere in our literature. So things around liberatory memory work and radical empathy and participatory co-design. So if we return back momentarily to Angela Sweeney and Danny Taggart's framing of trauma-informed approaches, they usefully outline a series of common misconceptions about trauma-informed approaches in relation to the mental health field, which I think have really good crossover to our field. So the first misconception that they draw out is that trauma-informed approaches assume that all service users have experienced trauma. So what they're saying here is that although trauma-informed approaches are based on the knowledge that trauma is widespread, they do not assume everyone accessing a service is a trauma survivor. The idea is that everyone is able to use services that are trauma-informed, and that these services can be seen as offering a gold standard actually for everyone. But if services are not trauma-informed, then trauma survivors will find it very difficult to use them. The second misconception they highlight is that trauma-informed approaches treat people who have experienced trauma. And I think this is really important for us to get our heads around. Trauma-informed approaches are distinct from trauma-specific services. So in the latter, the aim is to treat people experiencing the effects of trauma. Trauma-informed approaches are whole systems approaches within which services, systems, and processes are designed to minimise the likelihood of re-traumatisation, and that's a different thing. The third misconception is that trauma-informed approaches are purely conceptual. So it can sometimes be assumed that trauma-informed approaches are kind of conceptual and have very little kind of practical implications. However, it's actually the opposite. The emphasis is on practical, system-level changes in orientation and approach. They also highlight the misconception that trauma-informed approaches are implemented primarily through the work of individual practitioners. So they say that although individual practitioners are part of implementing trauma-informed practices within institutions, the emphasis is implementing change at an organisational level. It is first and foremost an organisational rather than an individual responsibility. And then the final misconception is that this is happening already. So although many practitioners do work in trauma-informed ways, and we're seeing great practice emerging in our sector, and that's wonderful, trauma-informed approaches do not happen without full and proper organisational commitment and understanding. So I want to pick up on the trauma-informed principles introduced to our field by Kirsten Wright and Nicola Laurent, but I want to do this by focusing here on how these principles can apply in relation to taking care of record workers more specifically. So going into a little bit more detail than they do in their article. So firstly, safety. It's fundamental to trauma-informed practice, and it is the foundation to the other principles, because as Nicola and Kirsten point out, if someone is not safe, it doesn't matter if the rest of the principles are being applied. The environment is just not appropriate for them to stay in. So ensuring people are safe involves their physical, emotional, psychological, and cultural safety. And I'm going to say a little bit more about building workplace cultures to protect psychological safety on the next slide. But we need to get comfortable with the idea that measuring the extent to which an organisation has created a safe environment for staff isn't about having the right tick box HR policies in place which focus on equality-based frameworks. A better litmus test is how staff feel on a Monday morning when they walk into work. So to what extent are workers walking in guarded, apprehensive, defensive, exhausted? And how does this differ across workers? So here I'm pulling on ideas expressed in Rebecca Tolley's 2020 book on trauma-informed practice in a library context, and that provides a lot of practical ideas around how organisations can gauge the relative safety of the working culture they've created for staff. So core questions might include, how comfortable do people feel in team meetings about things they don't know? Do they ask questions, or do they maintain a facade of knowing? How openly and frequently is information shared? How comfortable do people feel about raising concerns, reservations, or conversing about difficult topics within a team environment? How is criticism of the organisation dealt with by other team members and the organisation in general? How often do senior managers admit that they've got something wrong, or that they're sorry for mistakes or poor decision making? How defensive are people when decisions are questioned? How does the organisation deal with mistakes, failures, critical incidents? And how much analysis of power asymmetries across the workforce takes place? So what I mean by this is how much consideration is there that the workforce within a particular organisation is not homogenous. It's made up of individual workers who will have wildly varying experiences of being gendered, racialised, or subject to ableism in the organisational context. So to what extent are intersectional differences taken into account when evaluating organisational safety for workers? Trustworthiness and transparency means organisations being open about what they're doing and why they're doing it, and doing what they say that they are going to do. So for workers, trust and transparency is particularly important when organisations go through restructures and processes of change. The principle of choice means wherever possible enabling workers who are engaged with work around traumatic collections or traumatised communities choice over their workload and participation. So going back to the ideas introduced earlier that individuals may have different reactions to records and different triggers. So understanding this and responding to this by giving staff structurally embedded choice to disengage from working with particular materials is vital. And also it's about balancing workloads to avoid overexposure. Collaboration when thinking about protecting staff from harm means creating structures via team meetings and one-to-ones and appraisal processes which normalise discussion around the emotional impacts of records work and giving staff structurally embedded avenues for support. And then in effect, empowerment for workers comes as a result of organisations making structural change to enable the other principles to flourish. So I've led workshops with record workers where we use these principles to do some blue sky thinking on how they want their organisations to support them. And that's the kind of exercise that organisations can run with staff, which can provide quite a lot of useful insight when teams work together to think about what would make the culture feel more safe. What does trust and transparency mean to staff? What does embedding choice look like for them, etc. Now, I want to unpack psychological safety in the workplace a bit more now, and I'm drawing on a framework developed by Timothy Clark, which has been picked up by the Institute for Equity. That's at the University in Huddersfield. So what is useful here is that it breaks psychological safety for workers into smaller building blocks. So I would suggest that all of these building blocks need to be in place as the bedrock for then beginning to more specifically think about how to be trauma informed. So if these building blocks aren't right, then additional trauma informed protocols are more likely to fail. So let's look at these together. Firstly, inclusion safety. It's the first building block. So organisations should assess the degree to which they foster a culture of genuine belonging, acceptance and respect, where it's safe to share perspectives and participate, and where staff feel valued and respected. And this then enables an organisation to build in learner safety, which is about cultivating a safe environment for staff learning and growth. So where experimentation is encouraged and continuing professional development is valued, and where mistakes are seen as opportunities for improvement. This then enables contributor safety to begin to flourish, where staff are empowered to be more fully able to contribute their skills and knowledge and ideas. So where ownership and accountability can flourish, and that can lead to increased motivation and productivity. And then the final building block is challenger safety, where staff genuinely feel they can challenge their own organisation. They can express opinions, propose ideas, and this is the precondition for organisational improvement. So where there is this encouragement around critical thinking, challenging assumptions, and constructively and appropriately pushing boundaries. And research from the social worker sector suggests that there are 5 pillars that institutions need to have in place to protect staff from the risks of professional related secondary trauma and fatigue. And I think this also applies to our sector. So the first is awareness right across the organisation of what trauma is, how it manifests in our context, what strategies need to be in place to prevent it. The second is adequate supervision for records workers that encompasses and centres the emotional dimensions of our work. The third is the development of adequate peer support networks for workers. And the fourth is developing trauma-informed practice right across the organisation for all stakeholders. And the fifth pillar is equipping staff to model and practice self-care. There can be a tendency for organisations and professional bodies to only focus on the self-care pillar, pushing all of the responsibility onto the individual without paying adequate attention to the other supporting pillars that need to be in place in order for staff to practice self-care. Now, as I've begun to draw out, all record workers' experiences of the workplace are not the same. So Kirsty Fife and Hannah Henthorne's research on the experiences of marginalised workers in the UK archive workforce highlight how precarity impacts on safety for workers and how workers who are marginalised due to aspects of their identity face isolation and otherness. They're much more likely to feel unsupported, to experience unconscious bias, and that leaves them feeling unsafe and underconfident. There are excellent examples from outside of our discourse that point to workplace programmes that address some of these issues. So, for example, on the screen, I'm pulling out an example of a Black feminist healing programme that was put in place in the US higher education context in one institution. So in that context, racialised participants express common experiences in the workplace, including microaggressions, isolation, tokenism, othering, and erasure of self and community. And that was addressed through a Black feminist-led wellness programme where participants had the opportunity to cultivate and carve and hold space for each other, leading to a genuine sense of belonging and affirmation of self and culture. And I think there are powerful and beautiful examples like that of what can be done. But of course, a wellbeing programme on its own will do nothing if the kind of structural issues are not kind of challenged within the organisation. So these things need to go hand in hand. So what are the core institutional responsibilities that institutions should put in place to begin to reduce harm for all record workers in the workplace? Well, I've grouped these under limiting, normalising, supervising and training. So in terms of limiting, this is about protecting staff from exposure to trauma as much as possible. So concrete actions that can be taken is making sure that staff that are regularly exposed to traumatic records or are working with traumatised communities have regular breaks built in, have opportunities to switch tasks, and that project management plans are properly put together to enable slow work to happen. Normalising is about making sure that emotions are able to be talked about in the workplace and having wellbeing check-ins as part of team culture. So having and fostering a culture of peer support. This can be about ensuring that there are protocols in place to enable supervising staff to centre wellbeing in standard things like mentoring, appraisal and support processes. And there's lots of great toolkits out there from the library sector that we can pull into our sector around developing specific wellbeing plans for staff that are exposed to trauma at work. Training is vital, so enabling people who want to work in a trauma-informed way to be properly trained in ways to do that, building confidence in managing interactions with traumatised donors, subjects, users and communities. The gold standard is a course that organisations commit to a change process of becoming a holistically trauma-informed organisation. And part of that kind of gold standard would be providing specialist supervision and debrief opportunities for staff within that culture. On my trauma-informed module, I have had the privilege to have a range of guest speakers come and speak to my students who are implementing trauma-informed approaches in their organisational context. And they talk through the different measures that they are introducing in their specific context to protect staff. So I'm just spotlighting here one very practical measure that can be introduced for staff who are dealing with materials or working on projects where there is high traumatic potentiality. So when workers begin to become overwhelmed, it can actually be very difficult to articulate that to a line manager. And that's partly about having the confidence and the words to express your experience. But it is also because when we begin to move into crisis, even the effort of explaining that we're in crisis feels too much and we can sink further. And I speak very much from personal experience. So there are organisations in our field who are beginning to introduce just simple check-in systems within their kind of line management culture. So team members know to use a traffic light model or a number system, which enables staff to very quickly report to their line manager on their emotional state in a way that feels easy. So in the traffic light system, a line manager might ask staff members to report weekly or more frequently if needed. And they can just use green for good, amber okay, or red I'm struggling. And then the line manager then has established protocols agreed and known by staff on what their next actions will be depending on that reporting process. Okay, so the key remaining question is, does it work? If organisations work towards trauma-informed practice across all aspects of their organisation, including implementing proper support structures for staff, does this actually reduce the risk of burnout and secondary trauma for archivists? Well, the answer is yes, it does. And we now have empirical research from our sector to prove it. So a team at Toronto University have run a study which demonstrates that the implementation of trauma-informed practices results in lower levels of distress among staff, demonstrating that trauma-informed practices don't just improve services for users, donors and our communities, but also directly impact on the well-being of archival staff. So the rest of my slides are just some useful resources that I've put together, focusing on reducing secondary trauma for records workers. So suggestions for some toolkits that people can look at, guidance, different reports that have come out of the sector, and also open access articles that people can go away and have a look at. But I will finish there.
Thank you, Anna. That was really, really interesting. Have a think about questions. We're going to do that at the end. So for now, it's time to hand over to Irene.
I've not got my camera on. This talk is going to be very short and very different because I'm just looking at the practicalities as a local authority archivist that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, how they impact on our users and our staff, and we have particular challenges just now, and I'm going to speak about them in a minute. I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of Glasgow's history in the city and its archives and records. It will give you an idea of the scale of the challenge that we have to face in Glasgow. We don't have that many staff either, but it just is an important thing for us to recognise. One of the big things we've been doing since 2016, I have to say, is the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry. We're probably the one that gets most challenges because we're Glasgow and half of Scotland. So we get there's many other investigations, but it's a stark reminder of the evidential value of records and how important that is and the responsibilities we bear because of that. It does require our organisation, including ourselves, to recognise their failures and the resultant trauma in individuals and their care suffered. So a really important point, and I will be talking a bit more about as well the survivors rather than only the staff. But we do need to be aware of the secondary trauma which might be experienced by our archives and records management staff. Some of them in particular, our RM staff deal with it on a day-to-day basis, and so it's really difficult for them, and the scale of the role that they have to play is really difficult as well. And one of the things, and I was very interested to hear some of the things we ought to be doing, but it's how we at the moment mitigate the risk to both the citizens and the staff. So very quickly, I just want to talk about the city. And partly it is that some of the things that happen in the city actually impacts on the circumstances that people lived in the 20th and 21st century, and some of the difficulties that caused them. So Glasgow goes from a small cathedral town to a great merchant city. There was rapid growth in the 17th and 18th century, and that's largely due to tobacco and sugar and Glasgow's role in enslaved labour, which is very large, particularly in terms of tobacco. Glasgow has a really huge growth in size and density of population, bringing with it a lot of social problems in terms of health and housing. So it's a big issue that the city's been trying to deal with for a long time, and it causes huge housing and health problems. I was amazed at this myself when I first heard and saw this. It was the second city of the empire, but for a period, Glasgow was the largest city administration in the UK under one council. So although London was bigger, it was divided into various boroughs. So Glasgow had that role for a period. And you can see the growth, but it was 1 million plus in 1921. So it was really big by that stage, but it was a really important local authority, which had to deal with lots of difficult problems and continues to do so. I'm just going to talk about the city and its archives. So Glasgow acquired a lot of powers to intervene across a lot of wide range of new services. That was to try and change the life chances of the people that lived there. So they were certainly very interventionist. So of the police, the fire brigade, the trams, and you can see all of those other things. It's cultural, it's gas, electricity, it's even the telephone. So it's really intervening. It's municipal socialism before the word was invented, I have to say. So it's a really a local authority that's really trying to intervene and make a difference to the life chances of its people. Many of these were pioneered work in face of mass urban problems. And again, all of that tells some of the story that we're dealing in the 20th century, late 20th century, because of some of these difficulties the city faced. It was renowned for public health reformers, and there's a lot of documentary photographs that go with that. I want to talk about the archives themselves, just to give you an idea how big its responsibilities have been over the years, and the difficulty has arisen, particularly in terms of the child abuse inquiry, about the areas that we cover. The City Archives was established in 1964. It's the first local authority in Scotland, so a really important advance in archives. The archivist for the first archivist was the first qualified archivist in Scotland as well. So it was a really big difference made to the city's archival heritage. In 1975, they introduced two-tiered local authorities, which were in regions and districts. And the regions were had the large strategic functions, including social work and education, for instance, and police and fire. And without a doubt, a lot of the issues that we deal with in terms of the public and in terms of the trauma is around social work, particularly social work records, but also education. Glasgow was in Strathclyde region, which covered the city and much of the west of Scotland. It's a population of more than 2 million, so very large in terms of that. In 1975, Strathclyde Regional Archives started, which included Glasgow City, so the two combined. Strathclyde Region established the first records management system in Scotland in 1983, with social work records a top priority. And it's that early work means that Glasgow does have, and there's a lot of survivors of those files that people are absolutely looking for to tell the story of their experience in the care system. And then social work and predecessor records transferred from across the region, some dating from the 1820s. So it means that, and I'll just say that Strathclyde region was abolished in 1996, but with a very few exceptions, many of the records remain with Glasgow City Archives. It's maybe a blessing, but maybe not when we start to look at some of the things that have happened. And just to give you an idea of the scale of that and the coverage, It's absolutely immense right across that kind of west of Scotland. A lot of the islands, a really mixed population, and those records mostly are held here, and we use these on an everyday basis, particularly in terms of the child abuse inquiry. So in terms of the scale of the holdings, there's no doubt the most important records we have are the social work, followed by education, in terms of those records that we use for people who have been brought up in care or whatever, something, any issues like that. Many social work requests are for case files, and these are dealt with generally through the social work data protection team. That's not wasn't always the case, so that introduction of data protection did make a difference. We don't provide access to in-person visits by former care residents. These are instead referred to social work data protection and for the education for the other institutions. There is no doubt that the visitors often share their stories, which can be really very difficult for the archivists. Other departments can throw up unexpected challenges for staff as well. In terms of the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, as I say, it's been going since 2016. I have personally been dealing with it almost on a day-to-day basis. And those related activities, for instance, the court records, the police, the redress, offer further challenges. So it's been a really difficult time for the city. In terms of residential accommodation, and a lot of the people were brought up in residential accommodation, much of that data is unstructured, which presents challenges themselves, and they're normally closed to the public. And we'll be talking about the secondary trauma for archivists, and that certainly can be traumatic. But it's also interesting, we can see that ascendant relatives of current users, in particular record series, in terms of poor law, which I'm going to come to later, that can introduce further challenges and trauma to our users. I'm going to talk a wee bit about changes in social work practice. The situation used to be that we could refer, if any social work inquiry came, they were referred to social work to deal with, and all the people, those cases were provided counsellors. That was no longer the case, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It does mean that some of these things are a bit more difficult in people actually coming to terms with their past. Pre and post data protection, before data protection, generally speaking, that we did look at the records and we did pass them on, but mainly to social work. So they were dealing with all the issues around the trauma being experienced by the citizens. There's a large catalogue legacy, many with appropriate descriptions, and that's part of the problem we face, but need to carry out an audit for at-risk material. So we've not done that work yet, though sometimes, and I'm going to talk about some of those cases, sometimes that work has been done. We need to share our cataloguing guides to include information about how to deal with these. And again, there's a bit of that being done, but we need to do a lot of work around that, both in terms of staff, but also in terms of the public when they're trying to access the records. And so, for instance, I was just looking at that the other day, one of the catalogue descriptions had a warning in terms of some files that said fatalities in fire brigade records. We actually had a request which caused me to look at that, but it's really interesting to know that that was identified. I think probably with the fire brigade, but I might be wrong about that. And we also need to make sure, which we haven't done really, access needs to be marked as closed, both in manual and digital catalogues. So we've got that issue around people thinking they might be able to access and are not able to. I think we need to have a warning sign for archivists, not to look at or produced for the public. I have heard of people who enjoy looking at these things, but the reality is these records ought to be closed not only to the public, but to the archivists and records management, unless there's a need for them to look at them. I'm going to talk about the case files and in terms of our records management. To be absolutely clear, our records management files are not given any public access at all. They're all, any access is via another department in the council. To give you an idea of the size of the holdings that we have in terms of records management, and much of these are social work, we have a 1.7 million database entries in the RM system. And that's why I wanted to start explaining about that kind of Glasgow Strathclyde and how large it makes the holdings that we have much larger than they might have been otherwise. The staff in terms of records management, because they actually are the team that actually deals with case file requests, in the last 3 months they've had 856 requests with nearly 2,500 names submitted. It's not been possible for them to keep up with that, which is a really crucial difficulty for them. They do a great job, but they're not keeping up, and the data protection team are even further behind than we are. But I did ask them, because I should have known, but I didn't really know. I did ask them, what do they look at when they're producing a file? And basically they were very clear, partly because of the scale, they're very clear that they check an overall form which allows them to identify the name and date of birth of the person, but they rarely look for anything else. That's enough for them to produce the correct file to the correct people, but they safeguard themselves by not actually looking at some of the social work files, which can be horrendous, and the information can be really distressing. So in a sense, they have safeguarded themselves from that. They're absolutely clear they would rarely read any detailed notes. They might have to glance if the actual form didn't give them enough information. So in terms of the other things that we have are residential logbooks and admissions, and these have a lot of detail about the actual experience of people in care described on a daily basis often. Those are transferred from records management when identified. In terms of what the archivists check, we check admission registers as needed. We do not generally search logbooks or other unstructured data. And there are other mechanisms to support such inquiries and applicants, which will I come to later. So they've got a lot of work to do, and a lot of it is around all these things around the child abuse inquiry. So I did mention briefly that previously Strathclyde Regional Council provided counselling to all applicants, whether adopted or fostered. Relatively recently, I think, because it happened without any mention to us, they reverted to strict terms of the 1975 Children's Act, and that only obliged Glasgow to provide routinely for adoptees, counsel for adoptees. Again, I think that puts some possible stress on those of us who public do turn up and actually ask us things. We don't have that professional support that we used to have, which is a big loss, I must say. But to be fair, having spoken to social work recently, I'm going to talk about how we're managing to make sure that they provide some help where required in other cases. So data protection deal with a lot with the files now, so in a sense we've been safeguarded from that. These are transferred to GCC data protection as required. I understand that they refer severe cases to social work. So everyone doing this work, basically what they're looking for is professional help to support them, and sometimes that exists and sometimes it doesn't exist, and it certainly is not as good as it used to be. There is previous agreed rules for access to pre-1930 poor law records, particularly applications. I'm going to just tell you that arose out of a who do you think you are, which is ridiculous, but we actually had an issue about what we could provide, and having spoken to social work, we came to this agreement, and we'll just talk about that in a second. Now, part of the issue that has arisen, although they're pre-1930, And we do ask for death certificates as required, so that the public can access some of these directly. The process was to add later applications to the first. So sometimes we're not able to do that, and we then need to have to refer to social work or not produce the document at all. And part of the issue, as in part of the strength of Glasgow's poor law, it's immensely detailed, with often upsetting details of family life, going right back to the mid-19th century. It's one of our most important sources in terms of family history, but also a really important source for people and citizens who have been in care, either a residential home or a residential school, whatever. So it's a really important source for that. But the details can be really, in early period as well as the later, they can be really quite disturbing. And so one of these post-1931 ones that landed in my desk, and there's been several like that, was a recent case related to incest and a lot of other details, which a member of the public had asked for. I did try and contact the social work a number of times and ask would they deal with it, and it never materialised. So what I had to do is bring the person in, and what I'm very conscious of is we don't have the skills to deal with some of these issues. It's not what we're good at, but sometimes you've just got to do that because the person was even more disturbed with the fact that she didn't know what had happened. So the person came in, I settled her down in a seat and let her read it and asked her to come to me when she was finished. I was actually all right, but one of the things is it can be very, very difficult if we're left to deal with those issues when we don't have those skills at our hands here. So recently I've been nagging the social work, I have to say, and we have agreed that distressing cases can be referred for counselling. That's not only about people who are alive, obviously, it can be about people, about their family members and their parents or their grandparents. And some of those cause people a lot of distress, and sometimes you would be seeing as much distress as people who have experienced the system themselves. So it happens quite a lot. We look at these and we find that the social work have agreed, and get my fingers crossed, that they will look at those, and it means that we don't have the responsibility, we don't have the skills, and it's really important that the former residents of homes or schools get as much help as they can from qualified social workers. I think with this, I'm hoping we'll risk the secondary trauma reduced for citizen and archivists, because both of us deserve that somebody who knows what they're dealing with actually deals with this rather than ourselves. I'm going to talk about the child abuse inquiry, which I'm sure all the Scottish people here will understand some of the issues. It has been going on since 2016. There have been huge demands from Glasgow City Archives because of its coverage across half of Scotland and the very tight legal timelines. I mean, I always say that I will not go to jail if I don't have it in time with Glasgow's chief executive, but luckily that's not happened yet. And I must say she's very supportive of the work that we do here, which is a big help. We were and are aware of the huge, heavy responsibilities this puts on us. They are really difficult times and really difficult things to deal with, but it's really important that we actually do it as good a job as we can. The public deserve it and the city deserves it. So during COVID, one of the things that happened, there was a scheme introduced for terminally ill and 68 plus was introduced. And we needed to have a mechanism to help these survivors get the money in time, given either their ill health or their age. So I spent a year in the office. I'm going to say alone. I quite like being alone. I'm going to let them hear that, but I did quite like being alone for a number of months. I spent a year in the office, identifying and providing evidence that they were in care, allowing them to take forward their claims. So really important, it was a really important service to be able to provide. And the fact was, the information required was minimum, so I was not exposed and they were not exposed to a lot of the details that they would have been if they had access to their care files. But the downside to that is post-COVID, a number of these applicants came in person to speak to me, and in those cases they would often describe their cases in great detail. It is very difficult, and it was very difficult because partly it's sympathy for their experience, but partly a recognition that I don't have the skills, etc., to support them and counsel them. But it was the best we could do at the time, and we don't encourage them to turn up at this door any longer. In terms of the returns to Section 21 requests, which those in Scotland will know they are absolutely ginormous, they take a very long time. I've largely been responsible for everything pre-1996, but often for the period after, so a lot of work has to be done around that. It's really important, and it's really important to me that we got it right. Whatever the truth of the matter, that we actually told the story of the care of particular sections of Glasgow and Strathclyde children's life stories. So that was a really important part for us there. The request also asked about how homes were run, and from the start, I was very clear that this requires social work skills rather than archive skills. And to be fair, what happened was the social worker appointed somebody who was in child protection, who would come, she had all the relevant experience with the skills that she needed, and she understood what she was reading in terms of the running of the home and the nature of treatment for children. So in that sense, both my staff and myself were protected from having to look at that and decide what it meant. We didn't have the knowledge or the skills to do that, but really great that somebody who came and did it, and that was what was attached to this child abuse inquiry. And finally, in terms of the child abuse, a small number of staff, including GCC Chief Exec, the Head of Social Work, the legal rep, and myself received details of witness statements before relevant hearings. I can say I have never looked at one of them. I don't want to read one of them. I just file them. I just don't want to be able to see anything about it. It's not my job to do that, and I don't want to read what would be some of the most terrible stories that you could in terms of people who were coming up and complaining to the child abuse inquiry. So a really difficult period, I have to say, but where we can and where I can, we try to avoid actually looking at things and seeing things and comment where we don't need to, because we don't actually bring anything to that table at all. So a few other issues that I'm going to talk about, which the staff are having to deal with. Many applicants are supported by social work organisations. Again, this helps us. Some clients feel need for further information for their health and well-being. I've had a number of cases like this. Again, A, we don't have the time, but B, we don't have the skills to recognise what these are, and we don't want to open ourselves up to that. So they have provided a link worker who will come and view the logbooks, enabling clients to have a fuller understanding of their childhood experience, but not dependent on us and not depending on us sharing those terrible stories. So we agreed to this, and social work agreed that we could do that. I'm just very quickly going to mention a couple of other collections. And we have the images of the World War II war dead. And at one point they were requested for use in an exhibition. You wouldn't believe the MD would ask that. And they appealed against the refusal. Again, it was really strange. The only thing I would say is we probably did not know that those volumes included those images of war dead. So at least now we can identify them and make sure that the staff know that they're not to open them up because they're not for anybody to access. I must say the Glasgow City Council Head of Data Protection provided a wonderful response, citing human rights legislation and the protection of family. So it was really, really useful document because it meant that we did not have to produce them. People didn't have to look at their family members in an exhibition in terms of the deceased family. So that was a really important thing and something that I would use again if I had to. And recently, Glasgow City Council Glasgow Life requested fire brigade records for an exhibition marking the life of a citizen who had died in a fire. And I'm going to say, luckily, these were photographs of the street, and there were photographs of the street and empty room, but there were also photographs of fatalities for that fire incident, and these were clearly marked in the catalogue. So a lesson for us is to make sure that we change our cataloguing processes, make sure where things, right at the beginning, make sure where things should be closed are closed, and we don't have to deal with any things thereafter. So a really important lesson for us all, and I was really delighted. I'm not sure whether it was the fire brigade that did it or one of the archivists a long time ago, but at least it is a lesson that we actually need to protect ourselves and other members of the public to absolutely not be able to, not needing to look at accidentally have those brought to them in a search room. So that was a really important lesson for us at all again. And finally, I think we need to make sure we have policies and processes in place to safeguard all our citizens. I know this is about archivists, but in the end, we need to be working, making sure if we've safeguarded them, we're safeguarding ourselves as well. I do think one of the things when I was looking at this, and one of the things that occurs to me is a lot of our readers are looking at records that tell about a generation before. Some of those stories are absolutely terrible, and they're looking at those. And again, one of the things I did do was make sure, and these worst cases, social work would provide us with support by counselling the person who was going to look at them. I've got another one again that we're trying to get them to look at, and it is really, really difficult. Some of the things that they say are really awful, and I say, I don't want myself to look at them, I don't want the archivist to look at them, I want the professionals to be helping where they can. I do recognise our responsibility to value, protect and support our staff. And we are aware that they too may suffer second trauma, because I can't even say the word. We do suffer, we do realise that. What we try and do is make sure we are not dealing with it, and we would get professionals who understand that process, which makes it a lot easier for us. I don't think there's any doubt that looking at this and working about 10 years in the child abuse inquiry, we need to constantly review our systems. It's clear that they don't entirely work. We need to make sure we mitigate the risk to our archivists and records managers, who together underpin our services to the public. We owe it to them, and one of the things is to do it probably when we're actually the first cataloguing rather than going back to legacy, but a bit of work to be done there, and something we intend to include in our new cataloguing procedures so that that kind of information is clearly known and staff don't accidentally look at something that they don't need to see, nor do we produce it to members of the public. So thank you very much.